Hello everyone and welcome to lecture 9.2, Roles of the President. This is our final lecture in our combo unit on the executive branch over chapters 8 and 9. Before we get started, I just got to point out the picture on the screen. This is Dana Carvey from SNL playing George Bush. He was fantastic in it. If you guys ever want to have a good laugh, go check out some Dana Carvey stuff as George Bush, or really any of the SNL stuff where they cover the presidents, because they do a pretty good job. There's some really good ones out there. Anyways, let's get started. Let's take a look at the roles of the president and the different jobs he does. All right, so the first role of the president is as head of the state. Now, as head of the state, the president represents the nation, and they represent the nation really in a ton of different ways. There can be ceremonial roles that they represent the country. They can host visiting heads of state. You see George W. Bush there in two different instances. He throws out the first pitch of a baseball season, and so forth. Obama did that a few times. Trump didn't, but he's more focused, like he did football stuff. But that's what they can do. That's ceremonial. They hand out medals. They do public service announcements and so forth. But as head of state, they're also the chief diplomat. They're the chief person to work and represent the country with other foreign members from foreign countries, excuse me. And off of this, they're the chief executive and head of state. Now, this is really important because this is very unique to the President of the United States. They're both the chief executive and head of state. They have two different roles together. So what does that mean? It means they're the leader of the country and they're the executive, but they also are the person that is representative of the country. So when people abroad talk about the United States and who represents it, they mention the president, whether it's Obama, George W. Bush, Teddy Roosevelt, whoever. And if you look at other countries, this doesn't exist in the same way. And I'll match this with a close ally, Britain. Their chief executive is the prime minister, where their head of state is the queen. And you guys can understand the difference there. So the idea here is the president is the United States in this sense. All right, now on to the chief executive. They see that laws of Congress are carried out. So if Congress passes a law, it's the job of the president to carry that out if they agree to sign that into law. Things that they carry out or laws they carry out are things over taxes, housing and food, Social Security, and so forth. And then also, too, helping to carry out laws are over 2 million employees that are a part of the federal government to help carry out these laws, because the president can't just do it by himself. We're a land of almost 400 million, between 300 and 400 million people. He can't do everything. So there's influences there that actually need to be done or had, because even with those 2 million workers, it's impossible to supervise them all. So the presidential influence on that is something that's important. Also, having somebody in those offices that's highly qualified goes without saying too. All right. So some tools the president uses in his role as chief executive. One, they issue executive orders. And by the way, I want to say this. This also goes for governors as well. Most of this stuff can be looked at the state level for governors. So they can issue executive orders that are rules with the force of law. We've seen this within here in our current state of Michigan with Governor Whitmer issuing executive orders under emergency powers. Now, some of those have been overturned because the legislative branch said, hey, she used a law that should have been superseded by another one, but she still can issue executive orders. And she has done so with the approval of our state legislature. And that's going on all across this country, as with governors and our president as well. They can also appoint members to the government, such as cabinet members and directors of agencies and so forth, like we talked about in our previous lecture. They can remove officials too, and we mentioned that earlier as well, specifically when talking about cabinet members, but it's not just limited to the cabinet. They can remove officials. They can also do what's called impoundment, where they can actually refuse to give departments their appropriated funds if they're not playing ball or they're doing something inappropriate. And then lastly, they have the ability to appoint judges. And this is really important because all federal judges have to be appointed by Senate approval. And we've talked about earlier how this can be a benefit to the president or a deterrence, depending on which political party has control of the Senate as well as the presidency. But more importantly, the appointment of a justice is a very, very important thing, because even after that president's gone, generally that justice will be there. And that means the influences of that presidency will exist in the Supreme Court for much, much longer than what you see with the president while they're in office. Okay, now we're going to move on to reprieves, pardons, and amnesty. Now, a reprieve is a postponement of legal punishment. It doesn't mean that they're not facing legal punishment. It just means, hey, instead of having to report, let's say, in a month, you have a year or whatever. That's generally granted for people, like if somebody, like a woman's pregnant or something like that. Not used terribly often, but it can happen. Pardons are the release from legal punishment. We've talked about pardons before. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. The biggest example in terms of presidential pardon that you want to think about is Ford and Nixon. So when Nixon was he was going to be impeached, but he resigned because of Watergate, Gerald Ford, one of his first acts was to actually pardon Richard Nixon from any wrongdoing. And he did so mainly because he held the office of presidency. Now, the next thing is what's called amnesty. And amnesty is a pardon, but it's for a group of people instead of just one person. And this is where the government can say, all right, we're going to offer amnesty to this group that had actions against the government. The biggest example here is when Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, they offered amnesty to those of Americans that dodged the draft for the Vietnam War. All right, the next role of the president is they operate as chief legislator. And they propose legislation that they want to see enacted. Matter of fact, it's one of the most important things for them because they run on these platforms for election. And then also with the State of the Union, they say, look, this is where we want to go with my presidency. And this is the legislation we want to have. So a legislative program there for each president is their plan to solve the country's problems. And it's that State of the Union address. Now, are they going to solve all the problems? No, but may they solve some? Yes, or at least you hope they do. And when they determine this legislation and see what they want carried out, it helps determine what Congress will actually do each year, regardless if it's controlled by the rival party or not. That still can help determine what Congress is going to do. Now, some lawmaking tools that the president can use are basically political favors, their clout as president, they're basically using the power of their office, as well as veto power. The president can veto laws that are passed in Congress, and they can also do what's called a line item veto. And this is pretty similar to just a regular veto, except they can look at it and say, all right, for all intents and purposes, I like everything that I see here, but here's a couple of sentences. I'm going to basically wipe these out, cross these out. That's a line item veto, but they leave pretty much everything else in. All right, so now on to the role of the president as planner and leader. They're the economic planner, and this has been an important role the president has grown into really since FDR's New Deal programs. Not that the president didn't do it before, because they did, but remember, the New Deal helped expand the government, the size of our government, and its role in the economy. So the president has become much more in line, in tune with the economic strength and planning of our country. They have a council of economic advisors that study the economy and report to the president and help him work with the Office of Management and Budget so they can prepare a federal budget every year. That's a really important job for our president. Next, they're also the party leader for their political party. I mean, they're chosen by their respective political parties, whether it's Republican or Democrat, or let's say a third party candidate or another party gets in there. They're the leader of that party, and their job is to help members of that party get elected or reelected, and they help with political patronage to help appoint people to political office. They They can give speeches, they can raise money for them, and so forth. But this is a difficult role for the president, because if they're, let's say it's an off-year election, they're doing their job as president, and they might not be able to do or meet all these instances, and they're being torn in a lot of different directions. It's a difficult job. Next thing here is they operate as the chief diplomat. They direct foreign policy. Now, this has been a struggle at various times in our history because of having who really has the power, because of what each constitutional powers are granted to Congress and the president. Also, you have to look at if you have a very strong Congress or a very strong president, or weak Congress or a weak president. And you can see that there's kind of a struggle between foreign policy. And in the good times, you have both are strong and they're willing to work together. And I would say who really has the advantage is, when it comes down to it, it's probably the president, because they have to make a decision. Now, making treaties is a chief part of being chief diplomat. It's a very strong part of what they're supposed to do, because they have the sole power to negotiate and sign treaties. But for them to get approved, they need 2/3 vote in the Senate. An example of what I'm talking about where this actually didn't take place was President Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I signed the Treaty of Versailles, but then when it was sent back to the United States, there was a fight between him and a particular strong senator, and America actually never signed the Treaty of Versailles. So therefore, it actually never went through in this country. And in particular, that with the League of Nations was the big part of it. So, at least for the United States. The other thing they can do are executive agreements, and this is what's known as a pact between heads of state. There's no senatorial consent that's needed. You can see an example on screen with FDR's Lend-Lease Atlantic Charter Executive Agreement here with Winston Churchill in 1940. And then lastly, they can give government recognition to countries such as Cuba and North Korea. At the end of Obama's presidency, he recognized Cuba. That actually changed back hands a little bit under Trump and so forth. But they have the ability to recognize foreign governments as well as a chief diplomat. All right, now here's the League of Nations. I want you guys to take a look at it, and I want you to notice our president, Woodrow Wilson, proposed this idea after World War I, where you'd have this group of countries that would work for the peace of the world. We know kind of the kid of this organization is the United Nations. So if you know what that is, this is essentially the same thing. But you'll notice that our president proposed it, and we're gray the entire time. We never joined the League of Nations, and it was because there was no senatorial consent. All right, Commander-in-Chief is the next role of the president. They back up their foreign policy, so their role as chief diplomat is backed up, with clicking too far there, with military force as being the Commander-in-Chief. Now, here's the thing. They do have the power to make war, but it's shared with Congress, and you need to understand the differences here. The president cannot declare war. Okay, understand that. Congress can. So there's where the sharing part is, at least the first part. However, there are laws in place to where the president can use the military for up to, I believe it's 60 days, and if I'm wrong, it's 90, in a country or foreign lands without congressional approval. And then if they don't get that approval, they have to pull them back. If they do, then Congress would have declared war. Okay? Now, military operations and strategy within the presidency. They're responsible for key decisions. And I give you an example of Washington versus Shays Rebellion because that was one of the first instances in our country's history. Matter of fact, it was the first where our president had to make a decision as commander-in-chief. And now this was a rebellion within our country with poor Massachusetts farmers and all this other stuff, but we won't get into that here in this course. That's just an example. Now, many presidents we've had in our history have had a military background. It's actually been quite a while since we've had a president with military background. Matter of fact, you have to go all the way back to George Bush Sr. He was a fighter pilot in World War II. And then before that, you had many of our presidents. Reagan was, but he didn't really serve. overseas. Carter was, and so forth, but we've had plenty of presidents that have had military experience. It's really only recently where that's actually changed. They also have the authority to use the atomic bombs and atomic weapons, and they can use the military to contain disorderly conduct or emergencies. And one example that I want to mention to you is something that you guys all know. And you can see the man on screen. This is Eisenhower. This is on D-Day, or just before D-Day. But he was instrumental in using the military and deploying them in Little Rock, Arkansas, so that they could escort the Little Rock Nine into schools. So that they can do that in terms of using the military for those actions as well. All right, so real quick, if you guys want to, please feel free. You can watch any of these clips. These are the ones from the movie Sum of All Fears. You've got a couple of SNL clips, and then you've actually got some news clips from George Bush. And these are all meant to be a little funny. At least the SNL ones, are meant to be funny. The other ones are meant to kind of show the more seriousness or a reality in terms of George Bush as their role, showing off the roles of the president. You can watch these if you want to. You do not have to, but they're here for you if you choose to do so. All right, guys, that's all I got for you in Chapter 9. I hope you guys learned a lot about the executive branch. And as always, remember, go back, double-check your notes. Get those ready for the Chapter 8 and 9 test. Study, use them to study, and then don't forget to turn these in. And good luck on the Chapters 8 and 9 test on the executive branch. Have a good one.